Welcome to the American Institute of Healthcare Professionals videogram on Christian Social Doctrine. And this is a topic that covers what Christians consider to be legal and ethical obligations to employers and the state itself. So when we discuss social doctrine, we're dealing with the Christian as an individual, the Christian family as an individual unit existing within the financial and government type world in which we exist, our social hierarchy, so to speak. And there are two extremes usually that competes for this, and that's where we're going to talk about capitalism and socialism. But before we even lay that out, I think it's important to understand the foundation of the human person, the dignity of the human individual, and that of the family unit. So society itself exists for the human person. We hear a lot about Locke and his social contract, where individuals come together for the benefit of each other to form a community. They surrender certain rights, but for the overall good in itself. And that's a political philosophy. So a person's talents hence contribute to society. However, it's very important to lay down that an individual does not exist for society itself. Society exists to promote social justice that protects the individual's freedoms and intrinsic rights, but also promotes the collective good. And within the base of that is the family unit. And this is where all these rights must be preserved so that the family can continue to grow. And from that growth, contribute to society by giving its talents and the future, its children, to share with society, but at the same time respecting the individuals that it produces for society. And this is something that's very different than what we will see from what communism speaks of. So we have capitalism, which can exploit. We also have communism, which can enslave. So these types of philosophies or these types of governments themselves that go against these values fail to serve the individual. So in regards to Christian social doctrine and capitalism, we have an idea of wages and earning. So from Eden, God proclaimed that humanity would work and earn, and that man himself would sweat from his brow due to the sin of Adam. So it is from the very beginning part of the temporal fall of humanity that one would have to toil and work to earn a living. No longer would everything be given as it was to Adam and Eve in paradise. Scripture also promotes the idea of private property. It speaks of individuals owning things rightfully. It speaks of the seventh commandment, which is thou shalt not steal. It speaks of the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. So the idea of ownership within the temporal fallen world is very much supported with Scripture. And then there's the idea of justice. There must exist a social justice between the employer and the employee. The employee promises to give his or her talents and time to produce certain things that the employer requires. And in turn, the employer is to reward or compensate the employee through a just and fair wage. However, when capitalism becomes unrestrained, and again, the individual becomes the individual serves the corporation, The individual serves the state instead of seeing the value within the individual. This is when capitalism became out of control. When greed oversteps justice, then capitalism becomes a deterrent to what Christian social justice is. So in the end is capital or profit over the person, we see many, many problems. And in those problems, this is where the rich become richer and the powerful become more powerful at the expense of the poor. And this was very much present during the Gilded Age of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the steel barons in Europe and the United States very much so abused the human individual, making him merely as another cog in the wheel to run their mechanisms, their production within whatever they were making. So with the steel barons, ideas of poor wages, long hours, and unsafe working conditions were subjugated upon people, and even children. It was pretty much industrial slavery itself. So in turn, employees eventually became envious and subjugated to social manipulation later by Marx. And this would lead to even bigger problems that we still face today in the 21st century. Pope Leo the 13th in Rerum Novarum in 1891, he warned against the evils of capitalism when misused, and also new social doctrines that were emerging in a response to these abuses, but were later in themselves even greater abuses than the original. And this is where Karl Marx comes into play. The lies of Marxism were given to these working individuals who were abused, whose talents were misused, who were basically enslaved in these working conditions. So Karl Marx in 1848 brought about his Communist Manifesto, which believed that everything should be communalized, that there should be no private property, that individuals should all share in atheistic utopia, so to speak. And he equated it to the system of social oppression from the very beginning of owner and slave in the ancient world to lord and serf in the medieval world, and in the most present state, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie being the higher class owners, maybe even the factory owners at the higher level, and the proletariat, the workers. He saw that the workers were just as much slaves as the original slaves of the ancient world and the serfs of the medieval world. And in many ways, it was that, with the abuses that were running rampant in 19th century Europe and the United States, as listed in the previous slide, individuals wanted change, and they were willing to look anywhere to find that change. And when they were told that they may have all of these things, that they could become rich, and that they would have to tear down those who they envied for all the wrong that they had done, it appealed to their sense of revenge in many ways. So many individuals turned to the lies of Marxism. Problem with Marxism, though, is also it looked as the church, the hierarchy, Christianity as also a social form of oppression used by nations and used by big business. And therefore comes the famous line of Karl Marx that religion is the opiate of the people. It distracts people from their problems, and it's a tool that's used to manipulate them and keep them from finding true happiness. So within this rises communism, and from there we know the horrible situation that occurred in Russia, and later through Lenin and Stalin, the oppression of the Russian people, and later Russia would spread her airs throughout the world, causing the Cold War. And still communism exists to this day in some Southeast Asian and Latin American countries. With the lies of communism comes, though, what we spoke of earlier, that individuals exist for the state. So if everything is to be communalized, then the best talents need to be given to the state. And the state determines the individual's output or position based on talent, much like an ant colony or a bee colony. So human dignity, ambition is all stripped, and the individual exists for the state. So really the new owner of humanity in the communist system is the state. Instead of the rich baron, it becomes the state itself. Problem with communism, though, is that even though the idea of a communal utopia seemed pleasant and in propaganda very beautiful in terms of everyone never wanting, it's impossible due to human greed and corruption itself. And communism was by far, as a government form, more subject to corruption than any of the other forms of democracies or republics. And within it, it became very authoritarian in its very nature. And the state began to became controlled by one dictator who then hid behind the numerous atheistic lies that existed within it. And collectively, since individuals belong to the state, there exists no private property. And we saw this with many of the collective plans in Russia in the 1920s by Lenin, where individuals were forced to work on various farms and they weren't allowed to work anywhere else. And on these farms, we really see the idea of serf and lord really to the highest extent, not in capitalism, but it appeared in communism. And those who do not conform, they become a distraction and they become a disease, and they must be removed. And here we see where communism leads to persecution. And in that conformity also is not just your financial or your career, but also your faith. Once the religion goes against the idea of the state, then you also become a target for extermination within this system, because you are not helping to promote the ideals set above for the state to exist. Pope Leo XIII, again, who condemned capitalism, also condemns socialism in Rerum Novarum. And he says it's based off a false utopia, a false society, an atheistic philosophy void of Christian compassion, and it's very materialistic. There is no spiritual world in the communist government. It's an empirical world, a world based on what we can touch and what we can sense, and only the state matters. And in doing so, it strips human dignity of its individual needs, of that of the family, and it oppresses the multitude and persecutes the church herself. Christian social doctrine, hence, is kind of in between. Yes, there's an idea of communal care of one another, but it's through volunteer work itself. The individual is not forced to perform certain duties. They have individual dignity, but that individual dignity in their own unique journey is supposed to share naturally without being coerced. It has to share the individual has to share his or her talents to help others within the community and so forth. And that's where Christian social justice comes in, care of the poor, ensuring that there's just laws that help the poor, but also curb the ambitions of the powerful and so forth. Finally, the family. Again, the family is the most critical element to Christian social justice because it is the building block of society. And that's why the church has always defended the family against infringements that the state and the communist governments have attempted to do, or in more liberal capitalist governments who try to perform their own moral guidelines upon families and insist that certain things are taught within the home and so forth. This type of liberal conformity. So that's a little bit on Christian social justice and the importance of it. Within Christian counseling, obviously, it's important to have a strong understanding of Christian social justice and the dangers of capitalism and the dangers of communism if both are left unrestrained, and to understand how to help individuals understand the temporal reality in which we live in, where it is important to work the good the good hours, to earn the good wage, to love one's family, and also to help others in need, and to vote for just laws that promote society, not at the expense of the individual. So here's our Christian counseling certifications link. Our email is info@aihcp.org, and our number is 330-652-7776. I'd like to thank you for listening and have a good day.